Greetings hobbyists, this is Artisans of Vol, and in this video we're taking a look at geometry node gizmos. With Blender 4.3 out, I've been having a look at some of the changes such as sculpting, but one of the really big changes that I'm very hyped about is the new gizmos that are part of geometry nodes. Now to talk through this and demonstrate what they can do, I've taken a geometry node setup which is used to make tiled roofs, and we can change the length of this, the width in terms of the number of tiles. We can change things like the gap between the tiles of this, and we can even do things like changing the angles of the tiles if we want to, and finally we can boolean this all together. So this is all pretty nice and functional, but it's not the nicest thing to be able to work through because everything is in the modifier panel, and that was about as good as it could get in geometry nodes. But with the invention of the geometry node gizmos, we can now add gizmos to this and be able to do, well, things like I'm showing here. Which is really nice if, like me, you like creating geometry node setups that you can either give to other people, which this is going to be available on the Patreon, and the original version of this is on the Patreon as well, or you want to be selling them or using them for people that generally don't know geometry nodes very well, and having this visual representation is really nice. Now, this is the node setup for this. I appreciate this is relatively complex and looks a little bit intimidating. I should say I'm not an expert geometry node user. This is all very manageable in terms of what we've done here. And while it looks a bit concerning, there's actually quite a bit of repetition at points. Now, there is a video of this, so if you are interested in being able to make this tiled roof setup, then literally just follow the link in the description and you can go all through this one bit at a time, and it explains how it works and why it works, and then you can basically just copy it and you'll have this set up yourself. Alternatively, as I said, it's going to be on the Patreon, but that's not really the focus of today's video. All we need to be aware of is that we've got these controls, and they are shown, if I just zoom in here, if we just bring in an input, group, and group input, we can see all of the inputs that we've got here. Now, these are basically put around in different places being used for this. And to create these gizmos, we could do this coming off of any of these if we wanted to, but I generally like doing these separately. So we'll take a look at each of the gizmos in turn. I'm going to talk about some tips and tricks of using them, just so you get an idea of what these can do. Okay, let's make this so we can see this here. So the first thing we'll do is just add in one of the basic gizmos. If you just shift an A and then go to input and gizmos, this is where they're located. We'll start with a linear gizmo, otherwise you can just type in the name in the search. So I'll bring this in here. You can see this has got a fair number of options, and we get this just here. Now I should say this is at a slight angle because I've got this object at an angle, and all of these directions are relative to what we've got the object rotated at. So normally this would be pointing directly up. So we want to control the length by using this linear gizmo, and this is very easy to do. You just drag your group input into the value, and if it's not showing up, it's because you need to click on the gizmo node, and then we can see this. And basically the way this will work is if I drag in the direction of the arrow, the value will get more. You can see that changing over here, and if I drag the arrow back, it gets less. So it's a very, very simple thing to work from and really nicely visual. Now, we can also do a lot of things with this, so we'll go through those one at a time and make sure we're happy with what this can do. The first and most basic thing is we can change the color. We can have this basically being yellow to represent the primary function or a secondary function. We can change this to be the same color as the x-axis, the y-axis, or the z-axis, if that's going to be relevant to what you're doing. We're just going to leave this as primary. We can change the position of it, so I could have this higher or lower or left or right in the x direction. I'm going to put those back to 0 because there's going to be some interesting things we can do with the position in a second. And then finally we can change the direction it's pointing in, and I'm going to change that to 0 and say we want this, because it's going to increase in length on the x, to be 1 on the x. And now this makes a bit more sense. But we have an issue here. I don't like where it is. I don't want it on the origin, which is where this set as 0 will be, on the origin of the object. So I actually want this over, well, somewhere here. Let's just bring this down. I want this in the outer edge of my object, and we could do this with the position. I can just increase the x to here, but that would just mean that whenever I drag it, it resets to that position. It doesn't stick with it, and that would be really nice. So what we're going to do is set this up so that the position will work off of the length. And you can see this is a double line. It shows that this is basically the gizmo and they're working off each other, sort of in a constant rotation. The length is taking the value from here and then bringing that back to the length, which is why it changes here as well. So it's a bit complex. They have laid it out this way for a reason, which seems to make sense to them. But we're going to change this position so that it changes with our number of tiles so that it goes along with it. And we're going to do this using the position. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to bring in a value node. We could actually do this in a different way, but I basically need the thickness of this tile, which is somewhere in the region of about 16.5. I'm kind of guesstimating that. You'll also notice that now the gizmo's just disappeared because I'm now clicking on something else. And if I click on here, it comes back. If you want that to be permanently there, just click this icon and it means that you'll permanently be able to see that gizmo. So it's up to you whether you want that on. There's another slight effect of this. I'll come back to that in a minute as well, because at the moment we're looking at this node group. Then I need to multiply this by whatever the length is, because the length is the number of these tiles. You can see it's 3 and then 4 and then 5. So, or we can drag it to get more or less. So we're going to want to multiply these together. So let's just bring in a math node. So we can do maths as we normally would. Let's do multiply, drag that in, drag that to our position. Oh no, because we need to say this is only moving on the x-axis. So we need a combine x, y, and z. Put that into the x because it's on the x direction. Put that there. And now as I drag, it will go with it. But you'll notice this doesn't work quite perfectly. Look at that. It looks awful. I sort of drag a bit and then it goes back. Ugh. Now, there are ways of changing this. At the moment, if you'll notice, as I drag, it changes everything really, really rapidly. And we can put maths on this double line to make sure that that doesn't happen. It sort of happens at about the same speed as the arrow. So, what we're going to do is, if we just come in and bring in a math node, we can bring in another multiply. You could also do division, but I'm going to do multiply. If I drag that in there, you can see this adds into this flow. And I could change this up to something like 5, and now it's going to happen more slowly. So notice this is not quite as quick if I just take this out than it was there. So this, having a multiply, is slowing everything down. And we could put this even higher so it gets a bit closer to it, and that's looking a bit better, but actually I want this by this value, the 16. So I don't actually need to do this. I can drag that out, get rid of this, and not have this as a separate node. What I can do is drag this back through the multiply value. And you'll notice suddenly this is going through here, multiplying by the 16.5, and going into the value, and now this is a much better match. So you can have this nice little trick of bringing it through whatever you realise the math needs to do with the position, and therefore you know this is going to work right. So that's a really nifty trick that they've allowed you to do and not have to have everything doubled up. Though if you feel that's clearer, you could definitely double up with it. So that's pretty much it for the linear gizmo. Generally happy with most of the things that this can do, though there is an issue with this gizmo. It's a bit of a tricky one to explain. I'm actually going to talk about this in a separate video, so if you're not subscribed to the channel, do subscribe for that. But there's definitely something that I can see being what people might want to be able to do, and we want to be able to fix this. So we'll talk about that in a future video, as I said, and talk about why there's a slight issue there and how to fix it. It's not a big issue, so this is still great. So let's spend some time talking now about the dial gizmo. Now realistically, in terms of changing the width, this would probably be sensible to use another linear gizmo, but we're going through demonstrating, so let's not. So what I'm going to do is Shift and D to copy that group input, and then I'm going to Shift and A, type in gizmo, and we'll bring in our dial gizmo, just here. You can see we've got this dial gizmo. Let's drag in our width to the value, and click here and it comes back, and we can permanently have that there and visible if we want to. And we have the same list here of secondary, X and Y. If you want to change the colors, I'm going to keep it as primary, and we'll have one as secondary in a second. Now, if I drag this, you'll notice if I go in a clockwise way, it decreases the number, and an anti-clockwise way increases the number. And to me, that's very counterintuitive. So we're going to change that by just changing the up direction on the Z to -1. And now that makes much more sense, I think. So yeah, that's easier. Now we have the same issue here, that as we drag around, this seems to be a little bit slow. It's the opposite problem here. So just like we had to multiply here to make it slower, here we're going to have to divide. So I'm just going to bring in a math node again, and we'll just change this into divide. And then we'll just divide this by, let's say, 2, and that will make this a bit quicker, or maybe 4. So you get a lot of control over this and how quick you want everything to work. Now, obviously, just basic maths, we don't have to do this as dividing. We could do this always by multiplying and just multiply it by 0.25, and that's going to have the same effect as dividing it by 4. It's up to you how you want to go with this. I do have a preference of, if I'm going to multiply, always multiplying, but it's entirely up to you and how your brain works. So, next thing that we've got here, we've sort of dealt with position. This is exactly the same. We've also got at up. Now, because I've got this as a slight angle, I'm going to start fiddling around with this on the y-axis. So let's get that to about there. So we could do that properly, but that looks perfectly fine to me. And the other thing that we've got here, which for some reason, I don't know why they don't have this on the linear gizmo. Like, if you can control the size of this one, why can't you control the size of this one? But anyway, you have this option here of screen space and radius. So this is your radius. You can make it bigger or smaller. And it either works off screen space. Screen space means that however far I zoom in or out, this is taking up exactly the same amount of space on my screen that makes it, in relation to your object, look like it gets bigger and smaller. The other option is to turn this off. That's gone really small, so let's up our radius. And that will keep this consistently the same size relative to the object. And that means as I zoom in and out, it will get bigger and smaller. I have a tendency to prefer this one, but that's just me. I think it represents everything a little bit more nicely. So that's our dial gizmo. Pretty easy to use. Again, similar sort of idea. But I do think I want another one. So let's just Shift and D. And then we'll do this as a different color. We'll do it as secondary. At the moment we can't see it, but if I bring down the radius, we've got that there. I'll keep this the same so that they both get larger and smaller in the same way. And we'll just drag tile angle here, and we'll have that to control the tile angle. And being that this is something that's controlling the tile movement in this direction, that seems like I should probably rotate this round to something there. So we've got a nice lot of control on this to make sure it seems relevant to what's being controlled. And I really like this. I like this customizability of it, and the fact that we can change things like the speed and how quickly this works, or link it into the size of the object so it's always on the correct place. I think this is a very elegant solution to something that wasn't a big problem, but now that we've got this is really cool. Now, one other thing that I want to mention in relation to these arrows here that keep this visible is if I just mesh and bring in a cube, let's just S and scale that up, and then G and then bring that over here, is that now if I click on this, all of the icons come back. If I click on this, all the icons go away. Now, if we're not using the geometry node editor, we're not clicking on anything here. If I just take, let's say, the linear gizmo off, so notice the dials have still got that on, the linear gizmo doesn't. If I click on another object, all of them disappear. So they only come back if we've clicked on the object. But if I click off the object, so nothing is selected, and this is an important difference, you'll notice the linear gizmo's gone because I don't have this selected. So with nothing selected on my screen, the gizmos with this arrow selected will remain. So I can always just click off and still see everything. If I click on another object, they always all go away, and then click on nothing, they'll still be gone until I click on this, then everything comes back, and if I click off, you only get those dials. I'm not sure if this is intentional or a slight bug with the way they've programmed it, but it is something to be aware of. Right, let's have a quick talk about the last gizmo then. If I just come back here and we'll click on this, and we'll just press plus, A, and then full stop to zoom to our geometry nodes for this. And effectively for this, we're going to control more of it. And we're going to use for that, let's Shift A, and then inputs, and then gizmo, we're going to use a transform. And you can see this has a lot to it. Again, I don't know if this is a bug, but at the moment I can see position and rotation, but I can't see scale, even though scale is part of this. I think that's a slight bug with this. But you can see here we've got our gizmo for rotation, which are these rounder bits. We've got the gizmos for movement, which is the arrows, and then for scale, which is the lines with the box at the end. So this lets us do everything all in one gizmo. So for this, we're going to need to Shift A and bring in a transform geometry node. Let's bring that there. And at the moment, we've got this all set up, and you can see what this probably should look like with translation, rotation, and scale underneath. Again, don't know why scale is missing. And also, if you're going to call this, I guess position is accurate, but call it translation so it's the same. But anyway, we're going to change this, not to components, but to a matrix, which suddenly has this transformer element to it, which is what we need. Then we need to put something to our transform. So let's click that out, and we're going to type in transform, and we want a combined transform just here. So that's got everything that we need, and then we're going to drag this from the transform gizmo into the value, and then we can see we've got everything going on here. And actually, we can keep these gizmos visible individually from the look of this. So we can have only certain ones remain visible, or we can have the whole thing, though that doesn't seem to work perfectly when I click off of things. So not totally sure about that, if that's going to have any effect. No, that brings back all of it. Feels like this should be individual and only certain ones stay. Oh well. The other thing we can do here is we might not want all of these. So at the moment I can rotate and then rotate and change the size on that given axis. Let's just undo all of that. But I might not want all of this here. I might, for example, not want the scale. So if I come to the transform gizmo, go to node, you can see here we get the options of what we're going to have. So we could, for example, just have the translation on the X and the Y, and then the rotation on all of them, the scale on the X and the Y, but not the Z. So we can control that, or we can have no scaling, just movement, or we could have no movement and just the scales. So we get lots of control here on what we want to be working and what we don't want to be working. And you'll notice here that if we take one of those off entirely, then that arrow goes. So you can control what you're going to be using from this in a nice detailed way, and again, keep that control. So that's the transform gizmo. I'm going to be honest, I think I'm going to have less use for that than I will do for these individually broken down ones, because, well, this is just affecting the transformation. Maybe I will, I don't know. But these seem like the ones that I'm going to be really excited about using, as it just means that now I can have something where basically everything is more easily controlled on my screen, and importantly, if I was using, let's say, a tablet, and not having to go near my keyboard. And I could put all of this on with the exception of the Boolean. God, I'd love it if they put a tick box there. That'd be really awesome. And it'd be really nice if, when we moved these, we can see the tile angle there in the modifier menu just here. It'd be really cool if I could be on something else and this would just show the value. So it'd have the value written above it, so I can see that here, and then I wouldn't even need to go near the modifier panel. But there we go, some minor gripes. I think this works really nicely, and I'm very excited to be able to see what I can create with this. If you did find this useful, I'd really appreciate it if you gave this video a like. I've just realised that I'm creating a gap in this because I've put this cube in the tiles, which is not where I want it to be. So I'm actually going to delete that, and you'll notice that everything is now fixed and working. So that wasn't an error with the geometry nodes, that was me doing something silly. But as I said, if you do want this node set up both with and without the gizmos, there is a link in the description to the Patreon. This is in the 3D file tier, and I do appreciate any contributions that are given there. It really does, and I can't emphasize this enough, allow me to have the time to make these videos, and that is really, really appreciated. And if it wasn't for the patrons, I wouldn't be putting out video content as often as I do. I just wouldn't be able to have the time to do it. So really thank you, those of you that are patrons already. This is what allows this channel to keep going. Finally, if you do want to have a look at another video looking at geometry node gizmos, there's been a recent release by Default Cube that I've just seen, and he is a god of geometry nodes, and I'm a tiny peon in comparison. As I've said, my knowledge of geometry nodes gets me by, but he is absolutely fantastic at what you could do with him, and if you haven't checked out his channel, I would really suggest it. I'll put a link to his video where he does some cool things looking at how you can create all the primitives using some of these as well, so do check out that video if you've got any more interest in these geometry node gizmos. As always, if you did find this video useful, please hit that like button. It means other people will be able to find it more easily because the YouTube algorithms show it more regularly. If you really want to help with the algorithms, feel free to put a comment in the comments section, or do comment on anything that I've missed out. Like I said, I'm a fairly middling to lower level geometry node user. I just use them for fun things and little projects where I've realised it's going to be easier to have this set up once than have to do it from scratch every time, and geometry nodes are awesome for that. Have a great day, guys.